Hello and welcome to this webinar on the latest functionality contained within STRUMIS Evolution version 10.4. In this webinar, we're going to be looking at the enhancements and changes that have been made to the Enquiries module and to the estimating module as well. Throughout the course of this webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat window and we'll be evaluating those at the end in a Q&A session. So to start with, I'm going to log my initial point of contact with my customer by opening up my inquiry and quotation search grid, which we're going to come back to later to look at some new functionality here. And I'm going to hit New to load up a new inquiry record. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that in 10.4, we really have maximized the use of the real estate available to us on screen when we've come to look at the inquiry layout. So we've moved all the columns around, everything's now spread out across the screen, currency is now in line up here. It really has made the most out of the available space on screen. And with my new inquiry opened, we can see it's set to open on the status, and we can see that it's picked the auto number from my inquiry settings. The next step will be for me to pick my customer. So I'm going to pick that from my existing list of customers. And we can see that that automatically populates our contact details based on the primary contact that's established against that customer. Now, of course, if I wanted to create a new one, I've always got an ellipsis button here at the side, which will open me up a new customer record. And of course, for greater searching, I can use the binoculars to open up further details against each of my customers in a searchable grid. So we can see our filters are up at the top here. So if I was looking for Chris, I could do that and punch in that detail up the top, and Chris pops up in that little record there against the STRUMIS customer. Now, we have our exchange rate here, which allows us to specify an exchange rate that differs from that is used within the estimate, as the estimate's exchange rate is being driven by the facility. So we can choose that if the customer's requirement falls outside of the scope of the facility's currency. And we'll see here that we now have the ability to make sure that our defaults are populating. So when I create a new inquiry, whichever we set as default against our records in the lookup fields for salesman, our estimator, inquiry category, sales area, and building type, they will all automatically populate when I create a new inquiry with whichever record we choose as the default. Now at the moment this isn't connected to an estimate, so link to estimate is blank, and we'll notice at the bottom down here we're not going to be utilizing parent and child scenarios with this inquiry at this time, but if we were to specify that this was a child inquiry, we could select a parent from the drop-down list, pick another estimate to connect it to, or perhaps this may be the parent, in which case we might create some child inquiries that would contain the values that we require for this particular project. So specifying a project, I'm going to give it a new project name. So that's going to bring me to our next piece of new functionality where we've removed the limitations on character in the project and location fields. So now I can be a little bit more creative with the naming I'm using in project and expand out the number of characters used. I'm just going to put something simple in here. And in location, I'm going to put in here. Now I could obviously add more characters. As I say, we've relaxed the limitations on those. So with my first page in place, I'm going to hit save. So next I'm going into my design details. And we can see here that the defaults are in effect here as well. So we can see that everything from design type through to quantity surveyor in this screen is all set up with a default from the ellipsis button here, and that's been ticked on the defaults too. So that would allow me to either leave the default in place, or I could choose from the drop-down list or create new records, as I mentioned, using the ellipsis button to build a new record for each of these fields. Now, of course, I can also put in when my design starts, and down here at the bottom, I can add further project people. So I can either create a new with the ellipsis or come down here down to add, and I could look for a company using my search filter. I'm just going to have a look for Ace Fabs. And here are some existing people I already had in place. So I'm going to add in Lisa here. So I'm going to save that. Notice I'm saving between tabs just to make sure I have my details locked in. I'm going to go to my final details and specify my bid status is in prep at the moment. So none of this has been chosen. I'm going to put in my expected return, let's say 20%. My quotation details, I'm going to add in some predefined notes so that my inquiry quotation report is fully populated. So I'm going to put in my terms of use, make sure it's included in the report. Do the same thing for all of these actually. Add in my details for scope. And again, I'm just using existing records for this that I've already pre-built in my predefined notes, but I could always either modify the details for each of those or create new predefined notes if they fell outside the scope of what I'm already using. So overtype is still good in here, so I could change that from 2000 to 3000. Oh. And if I hit add, I'm not going to save the change, but I've made that overtype change here. Of course, I could always type in here as well if I wanted to. And I've got my exclusions to add in too. And I'm going to use final weight and value so that rather than being able to overtype the value to manually enter detail on weight and value against my estimate, I'm actually going to use the totals that have come directly from the estimate. Now, I haven't got any notes to add to the inquiry at this time. However, we'll be talking a little bit later on about how notes have been incorporated into the wider estimating module. So we're going to be talking about those a little bit later on. I'll put in some key requirements, and as we can see, the key requirements form has changed. There's now a new layout for this field, and as you can see, there are also defaults that will pull through for each of these fields as well. That falls for not only the named fields, but also for the custom columns as well. So if we use the ellipsis button, we can go in here, and as you can see, we can create new records as we would normally do off of an ellipsis button, but again, the defaults can be ticked too for these as well now. So as well as this form being new in the way that it's laid out and having the default functionality coming through, we also have an update now to the inquiries report, and this information is going to be mirrored onto that too. So we can see we've got general scope, we've also got materials, we can add some details into here, and again I could create new or specify defaults. I've got some detail here for fab and erection, my administration requirements, and some further requirements here from the other where I can put in some rates and values against the inquiry as well. Just to round off that inquiry, I'm going to go into project meetings, and I'm going to state that the design meeting has been conducted to discuss the customer's requirements, and we can go through and add different meeting details for each time we've sat down and had a conversation. And of course, custom fields are always applicable in the inquiry, as well as the presentation of any attachments such as emails or correspondence, or might be drawings, or any kind of file we may want. We can simply attach those on down at the bottom down here. Okay, so with my inquiry in place, I'm actually going to go back now to have a quick look at the inquiry quotation grid. So one of the new pieces of functionality we've put in here is the ability to use the batch update to now change the status of the inquiry. So as we saw before, mine was defaulted to open when I started. It might be that I've had some historic inquiries that need to be closed off. So it might be that I want to go down to some older named inquiries, and we can see that the status for these is open. It might be that I want to grab all of these, go to actions, batch update, and change the status to closed for all of those. And as you can see within this batch update, we also have the ability to modify certain key record details as well. So if I wanted to batch update the salesman, let's say my default that I've applied to each of those inquiries isn't quite correct. It might be that I want to, from this grid, build a new record and batch update that as well. And of course, we've got the clear function at the side here that we can use to wipe out those records if we want to make sure that they're cleared off. So if I then go to batch update, I've got only show open records ticked, so that's not going to show me those, and you can see that they've been disappeared from the bottom of the list. There were 16 record types, so they've now been closed off. So if I want to see those records again, I could untick only show open records, just max my rows out as well, and hit search. If we scroll down to the bottom, we can see the records that we closed off down here. And we can also see in the salesman column, the batch update that I put in place against the salesman has also been pulled through. So with our inquiry in place, I'm now going to go ahead and import my estimate. So I'm going to go to import estimate on the left here. Opens up my import estimate wizard. I'm going to go next. I'm going to do this as a bill of quantities type, and I want to incorporate my labor usages and fittings for this as well. A description I'll pop in. This was an apartment block, and I'm now going to go next and pick my estimate interface and pick my file out to import. So we can see here, if I full screen this up, I believe if I come down to the bottom corner and go display invalid cross-references only, I shouldn't have anything in there. It would appear that all my cross-referencing has already been completed. It was already picking up the references from the item library because of my persist cross-references that I've been using on previous imports. And if I draw my attention over here to the estimate subsection, we can see here that it's going to be picking up from the CAD interface the description of each of these items to then put those into their relative BOQ subsection. And we can see that the labor usages that I have in place in my system are being picked up, all except my channel posts, which we're going to see there is highlighted in red. Now I could always use the drop down menu, then pick an alternative if it was applicable to it. I'm actually going to leave that imported with none on it. We're going to have a look at another alternative to the way we handle labor usages in a little while. Now, interestingly, we can also see now on this import that we now have source phase and source paint finish being pulled through on our import. So on our CAD interface, we now have the ability to map these up. So we can see it's pulling through the phase and where paint finish has been listed. Here we've got galvanized against some of our parts. That's being now incorporated into our import. So if I then conclude this, if I go next and I'm going to keep my persist cross-references ticked. I've got no reason to do that. I'm not going to attach the files to the estimate, and I want to open the estimate up, so that's going to be ticked as well. So I'm going to go finish. That's now created me my estimate, and I'm going to go ahead and connect in my inquiry. So there's my inquiry added, and of course the project detail comes through here as well. So if I just save that, that's those two now connected. So that means that my inquiry quotation report, when I pull that through, it's going to pull the details from the inquiry, and it's going to pull the figures from my estimate. So if I go to my BOQ tab and I open up my BOQ sections, there's a couple of pieces of new functionality in the subsections themselves I'd like to talk about before we go looking at the steel contained within them. So the first thing I'd like to point out is the new option for the batch update. Now we can access that either by right-clicking or going down to Actions and Batch Update. And if I go into the batch update, you can see that the fields that we would normally find within our subsections can all be modified. So I could do something like change the naming convention for the BOQ code. I could change the descriptor that's coming through, modify the multiplying quantity so that all the steels contained within are multiplied by the quantity number on the subsection, or I could update things like the unit. So let's say I want to place all these as tons. I could put that as tons in the unit and then come down here to batch update. So if I open that up, you can see that the unit is set as tons. Now from within each of our subsections, another new function that we have available to us is the ability to use these little arrows down here to now reorder our subsections. So if I wanted to, I could take beam and I could move that down the order, and you can see it updating in here and in the tree as well. So I could move the order of that. And of course, as I mentioned previously, notes are now easy to access and utilize within various areas within inside estimating, including here in our subsection where we can go into notes. So I could either manually type in notes here, or I could use predefined notes to define something. So I could create a new predefined note for this. And let's say I want to put in something in here for a reminder for myself just to check my fittings before submitting. So I'm going to call this fittings, and fittings need to be checked before submitting. And if I save that and add it, I can have that now saved against it. And we can see here in our notes field, we have that note in place against our subsection. Now let's say, going back to the batch update, I want to do that on, let's say, bracing and rafters as well. I could go down to Actions and Batch Update, or do the right click, and under Notes here, I could drop in some predefined notes for that, and then Batch Update to apply that to multiple records at the same time. Now, if I want to clear it out of bracing and rafters, I can, of course, go to the Batch Update again and hit Clear Notes, and that will remove them from the subsections that I have selected. So before I go in and take a look at my steel within my subsections, I'm going to go to the Data tab, and I'm going to place my imported file into the bin review file location and save that. I can then go back to my BOQ tab or my new item view tab, and I can go into one of my subsections, pick a line, right click, and go to highlight in bin review. That's going to open the model view up for me, and it's going to highlight up the parts that I have selected in the background, and I can work my way through. Now it may be that I'm doing this to evaluate what fittings are required for that piece of steel, or perhaps the labour to fabricate it, or even I'm trying to work out what the overall cost would be for the erection process required. So all the functionality within bin review is all still available. I can go to inquire here and then see properties against the part. And I can do that for all the parts in this listing file. So another new piece of functionality that we have included in 10.4 is the ability to see the labour usage field directly inside the grids. Now we know that this has pulled the beam labour usage through as per our import a moment ago, but we can not only see the beam labour usage here in our standard BOQ heading, we can also see it in our brand new field and screen, our item view. Now, the first thing we see when opening the item view is the choice of what we'd like to pull through to our grids. So we've got the choice of pulling everything through from every subsection, just the steel from all the subsections, or the non-steel items that are contained within those subsections. And of course, we have this option here to filter for a specific named item. So we can use all of our standard filtering in here, utilizing our wildcards. We also have this option down here for showing fittings in the grid along with our main steel items. So if I just hit search on all, first thing to point out, the labour usage column is here. And the power that we have within this item view grid is really driven from the fact that, as you may have noticed from the way I described the searching functionality, the steels that we see in this grid are not constrained by the same view stylings that we have in our standard view, where the steel that we are seeing on grid is only contained within each subsection. So we couldn't see, let's say I was looking for all of the UCs across the entire estimate. I couldn't do this before. You can see here that it's placed in various different subsections. If I was to grab that subsection and just do a quick grouping on it, we can see that we've got various UC items in both beams and columns. Now, if I was to then batch update, let's say the section size or the price or something like that, I can do that from within this grid. So let's say that I want to find all of my PFCs. I can see here that the unit price isn't listed against those. We can see that it's also listed in various subsections. So it might be that I'd like to update the price on those. So I can grab all of those and go down to actions and go to batch update. And then here I could change the unit price for those. Let's put them in at 750 a ton. And there we are, that's updated the price. Now, in the previous versions of the system, I would have had to have gone into channel, channel post, and column into each individual subsection, find my PFCs, and then update those individually within each subsection. So it really shows the massive advantage we have to having this item view in place. And for our next new piece of functionality, I'd like to take a look at adding references to non-steel and free lines. So I've gone back into my BOQ view. I'm going to go to add non-steel item, and I'm going to put in some bolts. I'll have some M20 by 60s, and we'll stick in 100 bolts in there. At each. There we go. So I'm going to put some bolts in, and I'm also going to put in a free line, and I'm just going to put in some Hilti resin. Quantity, let's make it a nice 100 again. Cost code. We'll put it into anchor rods and hold them down bolts. And we're going to do that at 250 each. There we go. So there's a couple of examples in there, one for a non-steel and one for a free line. So as you may have noticed, inside each of these records, I could have just put the reference in there when I went through and did each of them. But in this scenario, I'm using it as if I've got a great number of free lines and a great number of non-steels. So I'm going to use the batch update for this. So if I highlight that line up, I'm going to go Actions and Batch Update. You can see here I now have a non-steel item batch update where I could change out the item itself. I could change the reference, so I could change this to bought out items. I could change the cost code. I could modify the unit values. I'm just going to do that and batch update, and we can see here under reference, bought out item is now associated with M20s. And for that Hilti resin, again, I can use the batch update and I get a different batch update for Freeline. So again, I'm going to change this to bought out items. And there we are, so they're both updated on the batch update. Another new piece of functionality is what we can do with labor usages. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is select all of my PFCs in this channel post subsection, and I'm just going to batch update those with a labor usage to start with. So I should have a channel post labor usage available, which I do. So batch update that. And now I'm just going to sort them by reference. I'm going to open up my first on the top of the line there. And what we're going to do is take a look at the labor usage itself. Now we can see in here, I have a line against drilling that is a quantity of 0. So what we can do now within 10.4 is have a scenario whereby, let's say in this case, I've got drilling. I might want to go off and evaluate how many holes may be needed on the piece. So we can now create a labor usage that has a 0 quantity on it that would allow us to go in after we've applied the labor usage to simply put in the quantity of holes required. Now this has been put in on an each calculation. So all I'm doing is saying in this scenario, I have 8 holes that are required against this particular PFC. So that's going to allow me to do the modifications. Now we also have within 10.4 the ability to now create labor usages on the fly. So we can use this 3-dot ellipsis button, and that's going to open up this existing labor usage that I already have in place, this channel post. And from there, I could modify the sections that are allowed inside this labor usage. I could change the naming convention, so I could obviously create channel post. I'm going to call this no treatment, as I'm actually going to go into the labor processes and I'm going to remove paint labor from this labor usage. So I'm going to take that out. I could also do things like modify the fittings, or if I was using fitting percentages, I could change the percentages there. So all the things we would normally do in the scenario of building a new labor usage or simply modify an existing one so that we have another one in stock that meets a certain criteria, we can do all that now within 10.4 without having to go off to the labor usages over here and building a new one or using save as new from within there. We can do it directly from inside the listing. So I'm going to go save as new with this channel post with no treatment. I'm going to close that down, and we can see that's automatically applied it to my piece of steel. Now I'm going to again put in my quantity of 8 holes there. And we can see it's got no paint on this one, so I'm going to save. And we can see that our labor usage has now changed in the grid to suit the new labor code that we're using. And the next piece of new functionality we're going to look at is surrounding estimate assemblies. So I'm going to go to the left here, go to my estimate assemblies, and then I can go into my truss assembly. Now, in previous versions of the system, if I wanted to modify some of the details to an existing or in the process of creating a new assembly, I would have to double click on a line entry to then make changes to the properties for that line, everything from the section size and grade right the way through reference, even down to the pricing source that I intend to use against it. And of course, then this also applies to any labor that we might want to apply to this, or if we're utilizing fittings for this. So now, rather than having to go into the line entry to make any of those changes, I can go into Actions and Batch Update. I can then batch update anything from each of those tabs that I need to. For example, steel item, I could change all of them over into a completely different steel section. I could modify the reference for them. I could even go into the labor and then either change the labour code, or I can do add labour and add independent labour entries for that, with the option there to clear out the old labour lines. So that would then mean I'd be replacing all of the labour that we have for each of these with whatever I set in here. And of course, it also applies to the fittings, where I can clear out the old fitting lines and add new fittings accordingly. So that's going to be incredibly useful for us when working with assemblies to update the data that we have contained within them. We also have another new function in here, whereby we now have the ability to change the facility for this, and I can do save as new. And that's going to then allow me to save this assembly to this other facility. It may be that I've been working on an estimate for another facility. Maybe I'm looking to see if there's a better pricing option utilizing the infrastructure of another one of our divisions. It might be that this assembly isn't available when I'm working with that facilities estimate, so I might want to take this particular assembly and do a save as new. So I don't have to change the name can remain the same now, and the facility can simply be swapped over. So now this will be available at my Hilton facility. Now it may be that I also want to transfer my assemblies over onto another database, and perhaps I've been working on these in a training database and mocking up some assemblies to test them, and I want to bring them over into my live. I could always go into tools, and we now have the option in the import and export tool to export estimate assemblies. That's now been incorporated into that list. Now, with the logic of being able to save to a different facility, we also do the same thing with fitting groups as well now, assuming that you already have the fittings that are connected into that fitting group associated to the other facility. We also have a facility swap option on the estimate itself. So if we go to the estimate and go to details, we could change the facility for the estimate itself to my other facility and then do save as new. And here's the little message that says it's going to remove all those extras and fittings and labor out of there. So I'm going to hit OK. So with the fittings, labor and extras removed against this estimate, now that it's associated with this secondary facility, I can be certain that any of those records that I now assign to this estimate are only working within the infrastructure capability of this facility and don't reference anything from the old facility. So another new function that we're going to take a look at now, if I was to go into the BOQ and see my shaft values, I've got value against all of these. It may be if I was to go into my beams that I want to update all of the pricing structure for the universal beams within this section, so or throughout the course of the estimate. If I go into setup and go material costs, a new function that we have available for us here is the ability to use grid options. So first thing we're going to do is do a quick section selection for UBs, pull the values into the grid, and we can see here that I've used grid options and show hide columns to remove from the grid the mill based rates, as I'm not going to use those in this scenario, and I've also coloured up my stockist price and my price unit. So all that's left to do here is just do a quick batch update against my BOQ stockist price, and I'm just going to change those values from 1000 down to 850 and save. So if I go back to my estimate and go actions, reports, and print the estimate report, and make sure that I use stockist prices, save prices back to the estimate. If I run that report, it's then going to change all the prices on the estimate for me. So now that I've run the estimate report and I ticked to save the prices back to the estimate, I should be able to, when I close this, see the value changes now, which I can in shaft value. So the only thing left for me to do here is to go back to home and recent and find my previous estimate, estimate 54. And from here, We're then going to take a look at running the inquiry quotation report. And we can see two new fields that we've now incorporated into the inquiry quotation report. We've now got the contact name and the project location coming through from the inquiry onto this report as well. So that might be useful to a number of you. Now, final thing, I'm going to go into my contracts management module, going to load up a new contract. And I'm just going to pull some details through. So this was my apartment block, and I'm going to set it for CAD, and pull my inquiry through to get the details for the contact and save that. And just to point out, I have on the key requirements tab the ability to allow the project team to pull through the data that was logged on the key requirements tab in the inquiry into the contract. Now this is obviously populated with all the defaults that I already had set up, but if I went down here to copy and copy from inquiry, I could pull through the specifics for each of those fields against what was logged originally in the inquiry. Now I did use the defaults for the inquiry, so these aren't going to change at this time, but if I was to make a quick change to the inquiry, key requirements, and I just change this from full design to design by client, and then change external detailing to detail 1, and then go back to the contract, and then repeat the same process. See the change. Now, also on the invoicing tab, connecting into some more new functionality that we have available that we've seen on our progress billing webinar. I'm going to go into actions, and I'm going to add my milestones into here from my estimate subsections. So I'm just going to grab all of those and add those in to the invoicing tab. So that's then going to allow me to prepare, ready to establish my invoicing processes throughout the rest of the contract progression. Thank you for participating in this 10.4 webinar. For those of you who had questions posted in the chat window, we're now going to do a quick Q&A session with Chris Eaton.